The 1990s are remembered as one of the greatest eras of gaming, though it was also seen as a time of change and disruption, as Sega, and later Sony, overturned the apple cart, breaking up the dominance that Nintendo had in the 1980s. It wasn't a one-sided fight, though it oftentimes looked that way. But in 1994, the Big N finally stood up for the first time and showed that they could hang with the cool kids. Stay here for the story of the time Nintendo punched back. The history of the video game industry, a tale now over 50 years old, can be summed up as a never-ending game of King of the Hill. Pick any era and you'll find the market leader was different nearly each and every time. It all began with Atari, the world's first dedicated video game company. You could say they started at number one by default, as no other video game company existed at Atari's foundation. Though it didn't take long for electronics companies and mechanical game makers to whip something up and send it out to market. By 1982, Atari was earning over $1 billion a year. Their home TV game, the 2600, had about 85% of the market share and was in about 1/3 of all American homes. Atari also ran successful arcade and computer divisions, not to mention that the company was the fastest growing Silicon Valley startup of all time. Fast forward a few years, and you'll find that Atari had been supplanted by Nintendo, a toy maker from Japan that dabbled in video games until it found success with one arcade hit, Donkey Kong. The game involved a pudgy little man, Mario, climbing a half-built skyscraper to rescue his girlfriend from a giant gorilla on the loose. From there, the company fully shifted to gaming, eventually preparing their own TV game, the Family Computer, which went on sale in Japan in 1983 and came westward in 1985 as the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES for short. The changing of the guard was completely unexpected and rather complicated. Atari became complacent in their position, thinking that the 2600 and its games could be sold forever. It also didn't help that mid-1984, Atari was split in half. The home and computer divisions were sold off, while the parent company held on to the successful arcade division for the time being. The new owners of the 2600 had inherited nearly 100% of the market and did not know what to do with it. Meanwhile, Nintendo was building inroads in America by securing exclusive contracts with retailers and game developers. A large amount of games that sold well in Japan were brought over with ease from the land of the rising sun, where the Big N was already, far and away, the top dog. The NES was about 6 years more advanced than the 2600 to begin with, and the difference between the two was clear. Mario, the star of that first hit arcade game in 1981, became the face of the company, with his games becoming bestsellers. Nintendo focused its marketing on children who weren't old enough to remember the Atari era. A monthly magazine, Nintendo Power, set up a perfect stream of low-cost marketing to its target audience. Those growing up into Nintendo's marketing strategy were hooked from the start. And while a more advanced Atari TV game, the 7800, was on sale all that time, very few gamers even knew it existed. Candy, clothes, and cartoon shows all helped cement Nintendo and its games as the status quo. By 1988, Nintendo had close to 90% of the US game market. Atari was in the single digits. There was a third player in all of this, Sega. The company was the most successful arcade game maker in Japan and had twice tried to win the home market there with the SG-1000 and Mark III hardware sets. Neither could outsell Nintendo. During the Atari-Nintendo transition, Sega sold a version of the Mark III in the US, the Sega Master System. In the end, it trailed Nintendo and Atari without much impact. Sega came back for another swing with the Mega Drive in 1988. Sporting a 16-bit CPU, the hardware was several times more powerful than Nintendo's. When the Mega Drive came to the US in 1989, it was rebranded as the Genesis. On both sides of the Pacific, Sega made no major gains, initially. Soon, a few events would totally change the game. In 1990, Sega hired Mattel CEO Tom Kalinske, who instituted more aggressive marketing and secured IPs that Americans had interest in. The home offices in Japan were creating a new character, Sonic the Hedgehog, for a groundbreaking new game. And with great luck, Nintendo delayed its 16-bit Super NES for over a year, leaving the next generation market wide open. All of Sega's stars aligned. Sonic was released in the summer of 1991, before anyone could buy a Super NES. The Genesis sold at a lower price, alongside an ad campaign that made fun of Nintendo while casting Sega as the cooler alternative. The plan worked. Sega took a majority share of the 16-bit market, nearly 60%, and the trend continued into '92 and beyond. In your neighborhood, you had your Nintendo households and you had your Sega households, but there were just always slightly more Sega homes out there. For Nintendo fans, being number 2 meant living with a constant stream of Sega advertising, which often mocked Nintendo and its fan base for being lame and childish. Every time Sega created something cool, like games with full motion video, or got the better version of a game, like Mortal Kombat with red blood, it hurt. It was hard to defend the legacy of the last decade in the face of blast processing and the Sega scream. Sega! And while the market was almost evenly split, 60-40 was a far cry from the heights of the 8-bit days, when Nintendo was a monopoly. Life on the Nintendo side wasn't bad. Some of the best remembered games were on the Super NES. A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, F-Zero, not to mention that the older 8-bit NES still had some life, and the Game Boy had more games on the go than anyone. The public image of Nintendo, however, left much to be desired. Nintendo's advertising wasn't bad, per se. Commercials focused on what mattered most, the games, but they were very bland and hardly memorable. Sega had rewritten the rules and therefore ran the show. Every time Sega tweaked Nintendo, the big N just stood there and took it. Turning the other cheek created a catch-22, where if Nintendo had gone into the mud and slung some back, it would bring them down to Sega's level. And, just maybe, admit that Nintendo was losing to Sega all this time. There really wasn't much Nintendo could do but take the high road and keep releasing games. The gaming industry isn't only a game of King of the Hill, it's also a game of leapfrog, with a constant arms race running in the background. New games and better hardware were always around the corner. After 2 years of being the punching bag, Nintendo got to work on doing just that. A new game that would turn heads and open wallets. The thing about video games is that once a new hardware set is released, that machine is set in stone for eternity. It can never upgrade itself. Games would incrementally improve, however. An NES game from 1993 was light years ahead of those made a decade before. The Super NES followed a similar path, as did the Genesis. It's a natural progression that comes from learning the ins and outs of hardware and building on what has come before. Hardware can be expanded with peripherals. When Sega introduced the Sega CD attachment, it gave way to games that were never possible on a stock Genesis. Nintendo resisted such moves. News of a Super NES CD player came up often in the early 90s, but never happened. Nintendo instead focused on individual chips that improved performance. Star Fox, released in 1993, featured the Super FX chip, showing off amazing polygon graphics and 3D gameplay, without the consumer investing hundreds of dollars into more hardware that would split the user base into haves and have-nots. With games like Star Fox, Nintendo made its case to sticking solely with the stock Super NES and focusing on individual game development. Though in the background, The next Nintendo was already in the works, something known at the time as Project Reality, what we know today as the N64. When Nintendo announced the project in 1993, it was scheduled for the far-off future. For the present, Nintendo was staying with the Super NES, and only the Super NES. The N64 would come down the line years later with amazing games in tow. Those games took time, and while Nintendo and its partners were releasing Super NES games up front, behind closed doors, a lot of people were hard at work for games that would see the light of day years later. One of those developers was a small outfit named Rare. Their history goes back to the earliest days of the NES, when they signed on with Nintendo as a developer. One with a unique case history that serves as the exception, not the rule. The company was British, based out of Leicestershire in the English Midlands between Manchester and London. Rare was born out of an exclusive contract based on the fact that its founders, Tim and Chris Stamper, had reversed engineered the NES, impressing Nintendo with a feat that was considered impossible. When Rare signed on with Nintendo, not a single developer existed outside of Japan. And at that time, the NES wasn't even available in the United Kingdom. In the early 80s, Slalom, Anticipation, RC Pro-Am, and Pinbot were some of the best Rare games developed on Nintendo's behalf. The company also worked with Acclaim, LJN, and other Western companies to build a portfolio of over 60 games, often based on American TV shows and movies. Outsourcing the work helped skirt Nintendo's infamous 5 games per year licensing policy for third-party publishers. The sheer number of games developed by Rare gave the company an advantage, learning the NES hardware better than anyone else by virtue of making so many games. Rare's games also had a certain style, with a strong Western feel and graphical elements that don't fully resemble those from Japan. One original idea stood out as the company's flagship game, Battletoads. Featuring side-scrolling beat-em-up action with a few race and obstacle courses mixed in, as well as fairly good 8-bit graphics and an intense soundtrack. It's one of the few NES games not made by Nintendo that still holds up today. Rare expanded Battletoads into a full series on the Super NES, Game Boy, and even the Sega Genesis. But soon after, Rare seemed to fade out of the consciousness of most gamers. The number of Rare 16-bit games was minuscule compared to 8-bit. In truth, Rare was busy investing in the gaming landscape that was still years away. Project Reality, aka the N64, was not a lone venture by Nintendo, but a partnership with Silicon Graphics Inc., who created workstations that produced some of the best computer-generated effects for Hollywood films. The company reached mainstream recognition with Jurassic Park, a film that could not have been made without SGI workstations. The arrangement was simple. SGI offered the tools and chipsets to create highly advanced games, and Nintendo, selling millions of N64s later on, provided a return on the investment. Being close to Nintendo gave Rare an inside track. Knowing that more advanced games were the future, Rare purchased 2 SGI workstations to see what could be learned on them. They weren't cheap. Each cost 80,000 British pounds. While these SGI workstations were intended for the N64, it turned out that they could also be used to develop games for the Super NES. For 16-bit games, SGI workstations could create wireframe objects, which then had textures and colors applied to them. A process known as Advanced Computer Modeling. ACM delivered graphics that looked nothing like the hand-drawn sprites seen in other games. The first game Rare designed in this way was a simple demo that was never intended for sale, though it showed the promise of what rendered graphics could look like in a 16-bit game. When Rare showed this demo to Nintendo, it was enough to strike a major deal. Nintendo bought an ownership stake in Rare, offering funding for future projects that used these techniques, as well as permission to use Nintendo's characters for them. In the end, Donkey Kong was chosen. He was familiar, but not as fully explored as Mario or Link. There hadn't been a game starring DK for quite some time, and those weren't so detailed. Rare could go in any direction without interfering with a series already on sale. It was a clean slate with only a few guide rails. The best opportunity anyone could ask for. In early 1993, it was official. Nintendo's original bad guy was about to make a comeback.
All right, son, point out the animal that did this to you.
The beast is back, now with 100 levels of pain. Donkey Kong, new for Game Boy.
With blessings from Nintendo, Rare took Donkey Kong out of retirement and put him back on the screen for the first time in a long time with Donkey Kong Country. First, Donkey Kong wasn't really the Donkey Kong. He was Junior. Rare decided to age Donkey Kong Senior and Junior in real time since they were last seen. Junior now wears a tie because he's all grown up. The OG DK was therefore an old man, transforming into Cranky Kong. Though for all intents and purposes, the arcade Donkey and the SNES Donkey are the same. With Cranky too old to play, it left the door open to create a new sidekick. Donkey's nephew, Diddy Kong, was born. From there, a flood of ideas came forth. A whole tribe of Kongs was created, as well as friends of the family living on their own island far away out in the jungles. From there, antagonists, a basic plot, gameplay mechanics, and goals were drafted. On Kong Island, Donkey is in charge of guarding the entire island's supply of banana reserves. Diddy is being trained to take over the family business someday, and is placed on night guard duty. That night, King K. Rool and his henchmen, the Kremlings, steal the stash of bananas. Primates versus reptiles sounds about right for the jungle. It's up to Donkey and Diddy to get the bananas back. The story allows the stages of the game to unfold brilliantly because of such a simple premise. The game can be played in 1 or 2 player modes. In single player, both Kongs are playable. Donkey is stronger, defeating enemies more easily, while Diddy is faster and can jump higher. Only one Kong is controllable at a time, but you can tag in and switch off. If the player takes a hit, that Kong is removed. Breaking a DK barrel can bring him back. The concept works like a power-up, wherein each life you have 2 hits and are able to restore yourself back to full power. In 2-player mode, each player controls a Kong for cooperative gameplay, but there's also a second 2-player mode, where each player tries to finish the game first. In contest mode, player 2 wears yellow clothes to differentiate from the standard red. Collecting bananas is the main goal in Donkey Kong Country, and vital to the story. Since the Kremlings weren't very careful during the heist, they left many behind. As such, bananas are littered all over the place. It's similar to collecting coins in Mario. 100 will earn you an extra life. But the pathways created by the bananas lead the player forward, guiding you on where to go next. Speed is the name of the game, and when the right pattern is mastered, Donkey Kong can zip through levels at a crazy pace, reaching the goal without missing a beat. Enemy placement encourages jumping on Kremlings to reach higher platforms, where bonuses might be found. One of which are letters that spell Kong. Getting all 4 earns a 1-up, as do balloons that appear in stages from time to time. Animal tokens appear randomly throughout the game, and resemble the animal friends of the Kongs that help out over the course of the game. Finding 3 of the same token will open a bonus area for a chance at more lives. Barrels, a staple of the original arcade game, can be broken as a save marker mid-level, thrown as a projectile, and used for propulsion. Rail carts and vines also help move Donkey and Diddy along. Members of the Kong family will be seen along the way, offering hints and a chance to return to prior levels or offer a save spot. The design of Donkey Kong forces the player to think more quickly than usual. The pixel size of the character is 37 by 40. Diddy is a little smaller at 32 by 36. Several enemies are bigger than Donkey himself. The total resolution for Super NES games is 256 by 224. That means the room for movement on screen is constrained, taking less time to move from side to side than a character who would be smaller. Compare this to Mario, who is 32 pixels tall, but only 16 across. Most enemies have the same width. It gives the player more room to move around in Super Mario World, and more time to approach oncoming objects. In Donkey Kong Country, the reaction time is much shorter, leading to a faster-paced game, with a higher learning curve. Good thing there are lots of chances for extra lives, right? In the game, there are 6 worlds with 6 or 7 stages in each. Donkey and Diddy move around on a course map, just like in Mario World. Each area follows a theme. Underground caves, snowy hills, coral reefs, ancient ruins, and industrial waste centers are just some of the scenery the Kongs visit. The game keeps track of how much has been completed. The more you discover and explore, the higher the percentage goes. 100 is not the limit. It's actually 101. But to earn that distinction, you have to find everything in the game. In Donkey Kong Country, not a single object on screen was drawn by hand. It was all rendered with expensive SGI workstations. Compared to most hand-drawn sprites, Donkey stands at an angle rather than straight profile. When in motion, his head, arms, and legs move independently. Objects like bananas spin a full 360 degrees. Because every element of the game was designed as a 3D model first, every angle could be captured, converted, and used in the game. Donkey and Diddy Kong look like action figures suddenly come to life. And all of this was before Toy Story was ever made. It wasn't as easy as it sounds. The game took 18 months to develop. The SGI workstations were not only expensive, but very slow. It would take several hours to render a single object. Some of these would begin conversion at the end of a workday and still not be finished in the morning. The SGI computers ran 24 hours a day. In summer, the heat from them was unbearable. In the winter, it was probably very nice. The soundtrack was handled by David Wise, composer of nearly all of the great Rare soundtracks since the beginning, when he was hired by the Stamper Brothers while working his 9-to-5 at a local music store. The background music captures the essence of the jungle. Drums were the foundation, set as if action was happening somewhere off in the distance. A strong backbeat is heard in every stage, along with horns and strings, depending on the area. It doesn't sound bouncy and cute, nor too dark and heavy. The Super NES sound chip was quite good at capturing the feel of live music, and it shows here. It all happened across 1993 and into '94, without a word leaking to the gaming media, all while the Sega versus Nintendo console war raged on. Nintendo and Rare kept quiet, knowing the impact of the fully finished game would be bigger than any minor preview. As '94 reached the halfway point, everything came together. Donkey Kong Country, weighing in at 32 megabits, was complete and ready for manufacture. The world was not yet aware, but soon would be, of a game that felt like black magic on a TV screen. More so when it was playable on nothing but a stock $99 Super NES.
Game Boy Color.
ドンキーとディディが40のコースを大冒険。新アイテムのグリーンバナナやミニゲームでさらに楽しいゲームボーイカラー専用ドンキーコング2001。
When Donkey Kong Country reached completion, Nintendo of America readied themselves to announce the new game with a special reveal at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show. Donkey Kong Country was the centerpiece of Nintendo's late '94 lineup and an attempt to rehabilitate its public image. Nintendo used CES as an opportunity to turn things around. The Nintendo booth was decorated with a jungle theme. A treehouse with what looks like monkeys jumping around inside looked down over the event. It was always making noise. Even Nintendo's higher-ups dressed the part just for the occasion. While other vendors had simple banners for their kiosks, Nintendo's floor space was something else. At the start of CES, Donkey Kong Country was still kept secret, though it was known that DK was back on Game Boy. To set up for the Super NES game later, Nintendo announced an updated version of the original arcade game. Donkey Kong 94 was perfect for the Game Boy, with 101 short levels that required a lot of brain power to solve. The pick up and play anytime puzzle action style is exactly what gaming on the go should be. Along with that, Nintendo made the surprise revelation that Donkey Kong 94 was the first Game Boy title you could play in color, thanks to a new device that played Game Boy games on the Super NES, the Super Game Boy. Newer games were in color on the TV screen and had custom borders that fit the theme of each individual game. Older games could use different sets of colors and have different border designs as well, including ones you could create yourself with the SNES mouse. Donkey Kong 94 with the Super Game Boy were brilliant cover for the design of the CES booth. The Game Boy upgrade garnered a lot of media attention. Donkey Kong 94 went on sale a few days after CES and helped reacquaint the character to many Nintendo fans, as well as introduce him to a younger audience, setting the stage for Donkey Kong Country later on. Games that would go on sale before Christmas '94, like Wario's Woods, Stunt Race FX, and Super Punch-Out, were just a few on hand that attracted an audience. What brought most to the Nintendo booth was a chance to see Project Reality in person for the first time. Development was still far from complete, but what was shown off impressed event-goers. On the other side of the CES floor, Sega was showing off their lineup for 1994, which included Sonic & Knuckles, a wholly new Sonic game that was also backwards compatible with older games, and the 32X, an attachment for the Genesis that promised 32-bit graphics this year at a price of only $150. An affordable way to experience the next generation without a 2 to 3 year wait. All of it was seen as a way to upstage Nintendo and others who were promising such things years down the road. Sega had established a few days before Thanksgiving when its best games, including Sonic, would go on sale, just in time for Christmas. The finale of Nintendo's CES extravaganza was a public keynote, ending with the reveal of Donkey Kong Country. When video was shown for the first time, the audience was amazed at what they were seeing. Even more so when told that this was actual gameplay. Everyone in attendance had assumed that this game was for Project Reality. When the presentation ended, Nintendo announced that this game was for the Super NES, with no add-on needed and no extra chips inside. The room erupted in applause. Nintendo dropped the mic by planting its flag on Sega's turf, with a scheduled release date of November 21st. As it turned out, Donkey Kong Country and the Sega 32X would go on sale on the exact same day. Following the summer CES, Nintendo launched an all-new ad campaign. A new slogan was drafted that tapped into the gritty, edgy nature seen in 90s media. Play it loud. Print ads featured bright colors, scratched text, and mismatched fonts, while still showcasing the latest games. TV commercials resembled music videos and looked nothing like spots Nintendo was airing even 2 months before. These showed gamers unleashing their rebellious side that spoke to a teenage audience. The ads often mocked authority and showed Nintendo as a fun escape, an underground club only for those in the know. Commercials for individual games had humorous gags related to the plot of each game. They all featured loud music, fast cuts, disorienting camera angles, and random flashes of light, all hallmarks of quality 90s video production. Nintendo also invaded other gaming magazines. Ads that looked like convincing write-ups from the editor appeared near the Sega section. These fake articles directly poked fun at Sega, claiming that Donkey Kong Country would truly welcome gamers to the next level. Nintendo Power sent out a promotional video to every subscriber, past and present, that told the story of Donkey Kong Country and its creation. The 20-minute VHS tape showed off how SGI workstations have reshaped the landscape of gaming, and will continue to do so. Lots of gameplay was shown off too, all while hammering home the message that Nintendo would never sell you an SNES add-on. And it never needed to, because they had cracked the code on making 32-bit style graphics here and now. The entire media blitz came from out of nowhere. In the end, the games were what really mattered. Those had always been seen as harmless fun, but that too would also change. Not that long ago, Nintendo and Sega duked it out in Washington, D.C., as Capitol Hill held congressional hearings with concerns about video game violence. Games like Night Trap and Doom were stirring up a moral panic. Sega championed the idea of free speech and consumer choice, allowing more violent games to appear on the Genesis, introducing their own rating system to keep games age-appropriate. Nintendo took a different stance and refused to release games that did not meet their strict censorship guidelines, a policy in place from day one. When the arcade game Mortal Kombat came home in September '93, the Genesis version had red blood throughout the game, albeit with a secret code. The Super NES version did not, The red blood was changed to gray sweat. Fatality finishing moves were also toned down considerably. The Genesis Mortal Kombat outsold the one on the Super NES by a large margin. When Mortal Kombat 2 came the next year on Fatal Friday, September 9th, 1994, Nintendo allowed the game to appear fully uncensored. The game carried a warning, may not be appropriate for those under the age of 17. Something unthinkable just 1 year before. There was one more about-face that turned heads. Nintendo made amends with Blockbuster Video, a company that the Big N took to court over video game rentals not too many years ago. Nintendo won its lawsuit in 1989, though the argument was over photocopying game manuals, not the renting of games themselves. It was seen as a dirty move, a way to punish stores, and ban game rentals without having the legal authority to do so. Sega stepped in, embracing Blockbuster and game rentals in general. Sega Genesis games are prominently seen in advertising. Super NES games would still be rented out, just not mentioned on TV. Nintendo and Blockbuster buried the hatchet for the World Video Game Championships 2, an extension of Nintendo's own Power Fest 94. A special version of Donkey Kong Country was created just for the tournament. For those who knew their history, it was a very surprising sight to see. The event brought Nintendo neck and neck with Sega in public image. It all led to a singular point, November 21st, 1994, when this new Nintendo let the monkey out of its cage to run wild on humanity.
He's the beast you loved on Super NES. And now we've captured him on Game Boy in an all-new game with all new enemies and worlds. Donkey Kong Land. New for Game Boy and Super Game Boy.
Donkey Kong Country, and all of its pre-release hype in America, was focused around November 21st, the Monday before Thanksgiving, the official start of the Christmas shopping season, and the same day, Sega moved to the next generation with the 32X. Once the game was on the store shelves, reviews started to pour in, with the industry giving their thoughts on the final version of the game. Nintendo Power had given Donkey Kong Country wall-to-wall coverage throughout the back half of '94. The official score in November was 4.4 out of 5, 88% on a 100 scale. The review called Donkey Kong Country simply the best, the ultimate graphics in the best action-adventure game ever for the Super NES, or any video game system. The only demerit given was that players may miss many of the bonus areas and think the game is shorter than it really is, encouraging readers to try everything to get the full impact. Donkey Kong Country entered the power charts at number 5 in November '94, reached number 1 in January '95, and hung around in the top 20 for 26 months, finally leaving the charts in January 1997, only because Nintendo cut the rankings from 20 to 10 as the Super NES began its slow sunset. There were other official Nintendo publications in other areas of the world. Club Nintendo from Mexico, which also had localized South American versions, saw just as much ink on Donkey Kong Country as was seen up north. A separate Club Nintendo from Germany did likewise, although these magazines did not offer scores in the same manner as Nintendo Power. The other American gaming mags heaped praise on Donkey Kong Country in '94 and '95. Die Hard Game Fan gave Donkey Kong Country the cover in November '94 and issued a perfect score. The review said it was absolute 16-bit perfection, with music to die for, that maybe the Super NES is 32-bit in disguise, and that Atari and 3DO must be shaking in their boots. GamePro magazine gave Donkey and Diddy the cover in December, with a pro review score of 19.5 out of 20. The review was longer than most, covering the basics of gameplay while offering many pro tips. Beyond the game itself, the article discusses the computer-generated graphics seen on screen, and tells the story of the last 10 years of Rare itself. In another move where Nintendo stepped out of its comfort zone, GamePro partnered with the Big N for a contest where the grand prize winner would receive an all-expenses-paid tour of the Nintendo HQ in Redmond, Washington, with other prizes including t-shirts and official strategy guides, something usually reserved for the pages of Nintendo Power. Electronic Gaming Monthly put Donkey Kong Country on the cover in October, though held off on an official score until December, when the game earned a Platinum Award and Game of the Month, with a score of 37 out of 40. The review crew said, "No other game comes close in terms of graphics, playability, and sound." That Nintendo does with 16-bit what others can't do with 32, and that the game itself is extremely long and playable. In December '94, EGM also released its famous year-end buying guide issue, which covered the best and worst from each year. For the '95 guide, Donkey Kong Country won 4 awards, including the big one, Game of the Year for 1994, which by default includes Best Super NES Game, Best Animation, and Best Duo for Donkey and Diddy. Elsewhere around the world, the game was scheduled close to the American release, a few days earlier in the UK, and a few days later in Japan. In the Land of the Rising Sun, the game was retitled Super Donkey Kong. CVG magazine gave Donkey Kong Country a score of 90% in December '94. Like every other review, the graphics were praised and discussed in depth. The review was rather critical of the gameplay, stating this was a game produced with the mass market in mind, so it was never meant to be overly taxing. However, the article also says that calling Donkey Kong Country just another platformer is like calling the World Cup just another football match. Total Magazine, the sole Nintendo-only magazine in Britain, gave a score of 97% in December. The review highlighted the graphics, of course, but pointed out the personalities given to each character through their designs and animation. The article says bluntly that Donkey Kong Country has no alternative, only offering up Mario All-Stars as an action game that comes close. The strategy of selling a next-generation game on 16-bit didn't really work in Nintendo's home country. The next generation was already there. Still, the graphics were the main selling point, and Donkey was advertised as the digital gorilla. Famitsu Magazine gave a score of 31 out of 40 in December '94. The Cross Review expressed their personal fear of monkeys, but found their worries overblown as the game was very fun. The reviewers loved the underwater graphics especially. As for 16-bit versus 32, one reviewer said that there are a lot of next-gen games that don't need to be on next-gen hardware, but as for next-gen games on 16-bit, no complaints. With regards to a Nintendo character being handled outside of Japan, Famitsu says, Super Donkey Kong smells of a game made overseas, but feels very Nintendo on the surface. Right out of the gate, Donkey Kong Country was a bestseller around the world. Day one sales in every region were over 100,000. In the US, the game sold over 500,000 copies every week for the rest of the year, reaching over 2 million units total by year's end. When the smoke cleared, 6 million copies of the game were sold around the world in 1994, becoming the best-selling game of November and December in the UK, Europe, Japan, and the US at the same time. In the US specifically, where the battle against the Sega Genesis was the closest, Donkey Kong Country met the goals it needed to, becoming the best-selling game of 1994, outselling Sonic & Knuckles by over 2-1, and the 32X by almost 4-1. Though records were not best kept all those years ago, Nintendo of America touted that Donkey Kong Country was the fastest-selling video game in history up to that point, bringing in over $400 million in the US alone. Nintendo also sold 3.7 million Super NES sets in the US, bringing the lifetime total since August 1991 to 15 million. Sega, to their credit, sold 4 million Genesis sets, more cartridges overall, earned over $3 billion, and declared themselves the winners of the '94 Christmas season. It may be true on paper, but it's also undeniable that Nintendo won the day with a groundbreaking game that stole the thunder from Sega, as well as all the headlines, which then became the best-selling and most profitable game of the year. In 1995, Rare returned with a sequel, Donkey Kong Country 2, Diddy's Quest. With the foundation in place from the original game, it was easy to take those elements and use them all over again. In Diddy's Quest, Donkey has been kidnapped by King K. Rool. Diddy calls on his girlfriend, Dixie, to join him in the rescue. Donkey Kong Country 2 was lauded for having even better graphics and gameplay than the first, and is still considered by many to be the best Super NES action game. In 1996, Dixie Kong's Double Trouble made the series a trilogy. adding more characters and locales to the DKC universe. When Diddy's Quest was released, Donkey Kong Country was moved to pack-in status, with the Donkey Kong set selling for $150. This helped push the number of units past 9 million, wherein Donkey Kong Country became the third best-selling Super NES and Super Famicom game of all time. That same year, Rare brought Donkey Kong Country to the Game Boy with a scaled-down version, Donkey Kong Land. Despite the Game Boy's limitations, Rare was able to apply the same rendered graphical style on a black and white screen. The game featured 30 levels and was compatible with Super Game Boy for added color effects and borders on the TV. Donkey Kong Land came in a banana yellow colored cartridge, and much like its 16-bit brother, 2 sequels would follow. In 1996, Donkey Kong Country became a weekly animated TV show. The animation style imitates that of the games, featuring full computer animation created by motion capture. The show began in France and aired later in Canada, which gave way to an English version. The show eventually aired in Japan as well. Across 40 episodes, the story of the Kongs versus the Kremlings continued, often with a lot of laughs. When Project Reality finally saw the light of day as the N64, Rare took the Kong family along with Donkey Kong 64, the only game in the series that plays in 3D. Don't forget the game features the DK Rap, one of the funniest, best original songs to ever appear in a video game. The original game made a comeback on the Game Boy Color in the year 2000. Though scaled down graphically, the cartridge comes in at 32 megs, just like the original, and contains all the same stages from 1994. Rare and Nintendo parted ways in 2002, when Microsoft bought the company outright. Though new games would appear on the Xbox, Nintendo always retained ownership of Donkey Kong, and as such, the Big N has reissued and remade Donkey Kong Country without Rare's involvement. In 2010, the Big Ape came back with an all-new adventure. Donkey Kong Country returns for the Wii. With Rare out of the picture, Retro Studios was called in to develop the game, which retains its trademark 2D gameplay with 3D-ish graphics. With much more advanced hardware, Donkey Kong Country Returns is designed with polygons rather than renders and features animated interactive backgrounds throughout. A version for the 3DS was released in 2013 with a few upgrades, including an easy mode and 8 extra levels. The graphics also have a slight wow factor when using the stereoscopic 3D mode. A sequel followed in 2014, Tropical Freeze, for the Wii U, where Kong Island has been frozen over by the Snowmads, bad guys who clearly aren't from around here. A Switch version was released in 2018, but it doesn't end there because Donkey Kong returns once again with an enhanced version for the Switch in January 2025, featuring all the extras seen on the 3DS and in beautiful widescreen. As for Nintendo in general, the Play It Loud campaign continued into 1995. Advertising followed the same style seen in '94 as more and more games came down the line. However, all things must come to an end. With the N64 becoming the focus in the late 90s, a new motto was adopted, one that still kept the feeling of youth and rebellion. Change the system.
Get ready for the hippest staple of them all. Donkey Kong Country, the legend of the crystal coconut, now on video. Hand over the coconut! Based on the hit Nintendo video game, it's the first feature-length 3D animated adventure and features all your favorite characters.
I'm sorry, have we met?
So get ready for a thriller of a gorilla.
Here comes Donkey Kong.
You'll go bananas for Donkey Kong Country, the legend of the crystal coconut, now yours to own on video.
For those of us alive and gaming in 1994, it goes without saying that specific year is fondly remembered as one of, if not the, best year for games. The 16-bit era was not ready to bow out and brought out the best in Nintendo and Sega. 32-bit waited in the wings, and that time would be incredible too, but just maybe the anticipation of the future and the excitement of the present was a feeling so strong it overloaded our brains and left a lasting impression. Really, we have Sega to thank for this. Sure, it was Nintendo and Rare who gave us Donkey Kong Country, but I'm convinced that without Sega, that game, and maybe many others, simply would not exist. Nintendo was on cruise control from about 1988 to 1994. Sure, the games were great, but there was always this feeling of complacency from the company. The Big N always carried an attitude of, we're number one, so why try harder? It also felt like Nintendo never listened to the customer. We will tell you what to play, and you'll do it our way, is probably what the reply would be to complaint letters sent to Redmond, Washington, if they felt like replying at all, which they never did. Then Sega swooped in, offered great games, and marketed things in such a way that you couldn't help but turn Mario's picture to the wall and switch sides. Thankfully, the strategy worked, which made Nintendo feel the pinch. Would Donkey Kong Country exist if the Super NES had a 90% market share? No! Why would they bother? Why invest in tech, development, and advertising to expand the pie when you clearly don't need to? Just let Miyamoto put out another game at his leisure and rake in all the money. Sega lighting a fire under Nintendo can't be ignored. But that is only half of the picture, because it did take a lot on the part of Nintendo to read the room, admit they were failing, and then fix the problem. Though I'd be remiss if I didn't add that when going against Sony, a lot of the old Nintendo hubris sunk back in. The events of 1994 brought Nintendo up to Sega's level, and honestly where they should have been the whole time. Competition brings out the best in someone, and with a game like Donkey Kong Country, it shows. We could pore over all the sales figures and dollar amounts and say who beat whom on what day, but to answer the question, who won the console wars, is simple. We won. Everyone did. From 1992 to the very end, you could get a Super NES or Genesis for $99 or less. There were over 500 games for each. Year after year, the games got bigger, more advanced, and more fun. Our hard-earned money went to the game makers, but they invested it back into the system to deliver a better experience next time. And it was all to beat the other guy, to which I say, keep punching back and punch harder each time. So when you dust off that old Donkey Kong Country cartridge, or any of the games from 1994, try to remember that things didn't have to turn out this way, but we should be grateful that they did. It's not called the Golden Age for nothing. You can't call it the Golden Age if it isn't the very best. And it can't be the best if you aren't doing your best.